I want to acknowledge the Diversity Council for Rollins College and the Lucy Cross Center for Women and Their Allies, both of whom co-sponsored the lecture with us tonight. So with that, I was reading Ria Brodell's website this morning, and the About section reads, Ria Brodell is an artist whose current body of work addresses issues of gender identity, sexuality, religion, history, and contemporary culture. And it struck me that this was such a simple statement that betrays a very complex artist whose art is such a good match for our museum, and obviously that was part of the reason we chose to do this exhibition, because their art combines art and serious research, which is of course so important for a college art museum, religious and gender issues, contemporaneity and history. And bringing all these together is part of what we try to do more generally here at the museum, and that is why, as I'm sure you have seen, I hope that all of you have had a chance to go into the exhibition called Devotion. That's why we have paired their works with some of the old masters' works in our collection. Ria Brodell has not one but two BFAs, one from the Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle and one from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, followed by a master's degree in fine arts from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where they reside today. And not only that, but they've had also quite a bit of teaching experience, which of course is very attractive to us. They've been visiting faculty at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Massachusetts College of Arts and Design, and both visiting faculty and graduate program artist mentor at Lesley University College of Art and Design also in Boston, Massachusetts. They have been part of exhibitions, solo and group exhibitions at numerous galleries and museums, including the Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, the Minnesota Museum of American Art, the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, the International Print Center in New York City, and works by the artist belong to a number of public collections and registries, among them the Minnesota Museum of American Art in St. Paul, the Davis Museum at Wesley College, which recently bought no fewer than 14 of the Butch Heroes series. And I have to say, and very happily so, as of the end of this exhibition, also the Cornell Fine Arts Museum. We have acquired one and possibly two of the Butch Heroes. We're still keeping our fingers crossed for the second one. I want to end by saying some of you know that I came here after having been the director of the Museum of Biblical Art in New York City for more than a decade. And so during that time, I had the opportunity to engage in many a conversation that talked about what has happened to religious iconography in the 21st century. And if we look at 21st century artists, how do they pick up that thread of symbolism, and who are the, how do they reinterpret hagiography, which of course is the writings on the lives of the saints, and who do the saints get replaced with? Does art choose in the 21st century different role models that may take on some of that symbolisms? And that was an endless conversation with very few good answers, but a lot of possible answers. And I'm really happy to welcome Ria Brodell today, because I believe their art provides one very feasible and very interesting and very 21st century answer to that question. So please help me welcome Ria Brodell.
Thank you so much. That was really, it's just amazing to be here. This is this is a first time experience for me, coming down to Florida and doing this. This is amazing. And I'm really happy to be here, and I'm glad to see all of you guys coming to hear me talk. And yeah, hopefully you have lots of questions at the end, and cool. So because the show includes both work from an earlier series called The Handsome and the Holy, and my current series, which is still being made, The Butch Heroes, I thought I'd start by talking about The Handsome and the Holy, because that led into the Butch Heroes series. So This wasn't the first piece in the series, but this is Self-Portrait as Rambo. And it was probably 2000. That series came about 2008 to 2010. And in it, they were mostly self-portraits, but also like small vignettes and stories from my childhood that sort of tackled my thoughts as an adult looking back on my childhood and the kind of things that I was into and just thinking about my gender identity and growing up Catholic and coming to terms with my sexuality and all of those things kind of seemed like a little funky. Like, I was into Rambo, I was into, G.I. Joe, but I was going to Catholic school and wearing the little plaid skirt and and so I just started to kind of think back on that time and think about the figures I was into, both like, pop cultural icons like Rambo and the toys I was playing with. This piece is called Self-Portrait as Hemans Protege. And all of these are fairly larger, like you've seen there, about 11 by 15, gouache on paper. And yeah, growing up Catholic in Idaho, like I wasn't really, I was kind of in a cave a little bit. Like we didn't have cable, we weren't allowed to watch like any of the current movies, so I didn't actually see Rambo until I was an adult. But we knew it was there. So my brothers and I would dress up with the red bandana and like go out in the neighborhood and play with our friends. And it was just like this. I don't know what it was, like the machismo, the muscles. I was really into the muscles. I remember for my first reconciliation, I had to draw. It's this. I don't know if you guys know Catholicism. Before you make your first communion, you go through first reconciliation, and we had to make these little books, and I drew a picture of St. Michael, and I was super into it. I was really proud of my drawing of St. Michael, and I showed it to my grandma, and she was like, "It looks like He-Man." So I was like, all right, well, I guess that's okay. But yeah, so Catholicism wasn't necessarily like a bad thing, like growing a kid. The only thing I disliked was that uniform and having to wear the dresses to church and stuff. But the stories themselves were I was really into them. It was really comforting to me. Like my aunts and my grandma were probably responsible for that. Like it just like they were people that I was like this St. Anthony finds G.I. Joe's gun. These are some of my favorite figures. It's St. Francis, St. Anthony, the Virgin Mary, and St. Philomena. And yeah, if I lost something, my grandma would say, pray to St. Anthony, and most of the time I was losing action figure accessories, because they're really tiny. This piece was a little later in the series. That's Sergeant Slaughter. If you're unfamiliar with Sergeant Slaughter, he was kind of the badass G.I. Joe that was like responsible for training the other G.I. Joes. I didn't really like him very much. And so that's me actually as an adult. So this piece, like, when I think back on it, when I was making it, I didn't quite know really how to pinpoint what it was about. But now it's called Man Up, and it kind of dawns on me that it's sort of about my gender identity and whether or not I'm like, I'm in the middle of this rope and I'm kind of struggling with it. This was like 2010, and it's like, am I queer enough? Am I trans enough? Like where am I going? What am I doing? Who am I? And this piece like kind of led me to thinking about like my body and like as I get older, like how am I going to relate to this like queer body, this trans body? And so I did this series of self-portraits as an old man. So this is self-portrait as an old man in the future, as we're all gonna wear spandex spacesuits. And this is self-portrait as an old man whittling, probably more realistic, although I don't know how to whittle yet. And then this one is self-portrait as an old man sports fan, very realistic. I almost thought I'd have to amend this shirt because the Vikings made it to the NFC Championship game. I don't know if you guys follow football, but This is like when they finally win the Super Bowl in 2063, but luckily that didn't happen, so I don't have to deal with it because they collapsed in full Vikings fashion. But anyway, so thinking about the future obviously led me to thinking about my, the past. And with this piece, this was 2010, and it's self-portrait as a nun or self-portrait as a monk, circa 1250. And I remembered, it's kind of sprung from this time where I remembered picking up the catechism book, and I was in high school, off of my dad's bookshelf, and kind of not wanting to look up the definition of homosexuality, but really wanting to know what the church thought about homosexuality and what was I supposed to be doing. And in it, vaguely remember it saying this was your cross to bear, which was a common saying in my family, when there was a hardship, So it's your cross to bear, and you're supposed to, live a life of celibacy and service to the church, perhaps. And yeah, I was kind of okay, luckily I have other options now, right? But that got me thinking, what would I have done if I was born into another era? And what would my options have been? And then also, given my gender identity, how could I have chosen nun or monk? I don't know, where would I want to be? So yeah, this was sort of me looking at the past, and at the same time, I teach at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I teach in the galleries, drawing classes to teens, and I ran across these guys in the medieval section, and I was oh, awesome. They reminded me of the holy cards I grew up with. I guess St. Vincent with the millstone, and St. Stephen with the stones lodged in his head. And I just loved their blasé expression and the little trickle of blood coming down St. Stephen's forehead. He's fine with those stones being in there. And I just immediately thought of the holy cards and immediately thought, okay, this is what I need to do. I need to, I need to use this in some way. So I thought about those holy cards, and I love them. I still have some of them. This is St. Hubert. I just love their detail. I love that some of them are kind of funny. I love this, the little cross floating between the antlers of the deer, and he's got his arm around the neck of the deer. It's really cute. And they're super colorful. And this is one of my favorites, St. Lucy. I love the St. Lucy card in the exhibit. And yeah, she was one of my aunt's favorites, actually, because my aunt was blind, and she's the patron saint of the blind. And yeah, there's another version of St. Lucy. I think this one's funny because it's kind of she's rolling her eyes. But and sometimes they're kind of gruesome, St. Bartholomew here. This one's not so bad. He's holding the cleaver, he was flayed alive. But in the background, there's the punishment is kind of taking place back there. And then sometimes they're even more gruesome. And I was all flipped back to the other one. Sorry. I was really into those details, those gory details, where I was really attracted to those. And just the little hints at the symbolism and the storytelling. And so I knew I wanted to use that format. And I knew that I wanted to start searching for people in history that I could identify with. And so that's how it started. I went to the public library, and I went to the queer aisle, and just kind of started looking through the books. And I was a little I had to branch out quickly because we didn't have a great collection in the Boston Public Library. It was very male-centric, very Eurocentric, and a little frustrating. And a lot of the stories in the books are very general. They won't list names of actual real people. They'll tell the story, and then it'll just leave out the names. And that's really important to me. So when I find a person, I want to include their name. I need to find their dates. And then I include as many names as they have if it fits on the banner. Some of them had 1 million of them. But so chosen name and given name for research purposes. And I had to set certain criteria for myself so that I could keep it, mostly I wanted to keep it personal. I wanted to find, because the whole impetus was like, how would I have lived my life? Likely I wouldn't have been as brave as the people I depict, but it was just something that I felt like would give it a more personal direction. So I searched for people who were assigned female at birth, presented themselves in a more masculine than feminine way. So that could mean they performed a job that was traditionally meant for men. It could mean that they passed as men. Some of them passed as men or lived as women simultaneously, or identified as men, and then had relationships with women is the other criteria. So pretty specific. And then, once I find them, then it's all about verifying those sources and making sure that the story is true and that I'm presenting it in an accurate way. So the first person I painted and then one of the first people I found was Katerina Link, or A.K. Anastasius. And that's because their trial was pretty well known. And then the trial records were translated in the 80s into English, so you can find them pretty easily. They were convicted of female sodomy in Prussia and put to death in 1721. And it was interesting, they had to debate, the jurors couldn't decide how to punish them. They couldn't decide whether it warranted the death penalty, because there was a clear punishment for male sodomy, and that was standard beheading by sword. But for female sodomy, they were like, well, there was no fleshly union. There's this that was the term. But they used this, lifeless instrument, so there's clearly a crime. And punishment for female sexual crimes was burning alive. So then they couldn't decide, okay, if there's clearly a sexual act, but was it sodomy? So does it warrant the death penalty? So then they left it to the king. And the king decided, well, we'll just cover all our bases. And so they beheaded them by sword and then burned the body. So, So that was that one I made super Catholic, because the story was just right there. I needed the gold background and the flames and the smoke. And I don't know, I just immediately got that image. And then this one too, kind of struck me as a very, very Catholic story. Also, they almost were canonized. So this was Caterina Visani, or Giovanni Bordoni. And when they died, they dissected them to try to determine the cause of homosexuality, which of course they didn't find. But they list off all the organs that they looked at specifically. So I thought of St. Lucy with the eyeballs on the platter. And so then I include all the organs there. So we have the intestines and the gallbladder and the fallopian tubes and all that stuff. And then they were seen as a virgin because sex between women wasn't a thing. So even though they had many sexual relationships with women, they were given a virginal funeral, which means they were dressed all in white and given a procession, and there were flowers and garlands, and it became pretty famous. Lots of people came to their funeral, and that's where they were almost canonized. That would have been pretty awesome. And then I try to go as far back as possible. That's pretty difficult because the further back, the less information there is, and often there's not a name attached. And I'm also trying to find people from as many different parts of the world as possible. This is as far back as I've been able to find. This is Katharina Hetzeldorfer from 1477 in Germany. And again, they couldn't figure out what the crime was. They knew that there was, something wrong, but again, female sexuality was not something that could be, they didn't know what to do with that. But the fact that there was this, in this case, it was called a leather contrivance, that was used, and the fact that they dressed as a man and presented themselves as a man, that was the big crime, the gender transgression. Taking the place of a man was seen as a bigger crime. And so the punishment they were given actually reinforces that. This drowning in the Rhine was a punishment left, it was reserved for women. So it was they were kind of inserting that fact, hitting it home. So some of the people I'm painting identified as women, and I should say too that when I determine whether they belong in the series, I'm trying to find their own voice, which is sometimes possible, and then other times I have to look at how they lived their life, how they presented themselves, how they dressed, maybe accounts from friends and family, that kind of thing, to determine whether they fit in the series. And then I use the pronouns that they were presenting with. So yeah, some of them identified as women. Like Rosa Bonheur was a very famous French painter at the time. And yeah, she petitioned the French government so that she could wear pants while she was painting. And she also had to fight to give her property, or will her property to her wife when she died. So Olga, also identified as a woman, Olga Superbiller, was a pretty famous Soviet mathematician during her day. Others went back and forth with their gender identity, and yeah, sometimes presented as men, sometimes presented as women, depending on what was going on at the time. This person became pretty famous during their lifetime and was able to actually go to the Pope and ask permission to retire as a man, taking the name Alonso Diaz Ramirez de Guzman, and going and moving back to Mexico and living as a mule driver eventually. And yeah, it's a really long and elaborate story. Okahara Seiko, actually, when they came of age, chose a name that had no indication of gender. Seiko means clear lake. And together with their partner, Watanabe Siren, they opened up a school that was co-educational so that girls could attend, because at the time in Japan, like, girls couldn't attend schools, and so you had to be like pretty wealthy in order to have like personal training. So they opened up a school, and in this case, like, I included the cat because they find cat prints on their paintings. And in the background, these two paintings in the background are actually in the MFA Boston collection. So I put those in the background unfinished, just kind of like in progress. Some of them identified as men, and you find the information because there were deathbed discoveries, as a term that I can, if I'm struggling on finding someone, you can often enter in deathbed discovery into a newspaper database and find a whole lot of stories. But yeah, so the body would be prepared for burial, and they would discover like, oh, okay, Captain Wright, Captain Wright. After they were discovered, after their death, the story was published for like 3 consecutive Sundays in the paper, in the London Chronicle. And that's how I came across them. They would bet on the reproductive capabilities of rabbits and win tons of money. So this one was simultaneously like super fun to paint and also very aggravating because of all the patterns that Victorian interiors had. And I got really into the details. So all the prints on the walls were actually like Victorian prints. The book on the table is called Four-Footed Lovers, which is an actual book about rabbits. Yeah. So that one was pretty fun. And this one's in the show. Sometimes I have to take the stories with a grain of salt. So like you'll find them after they're discovered, the newspapers will publish a story, but often it was kind of fabricated to help the general public make sense of it. So in this case, Mr. and Mrs. Howe were blackmailed, and they actually took the blackmailer to court and won, and then afterwards, the story in the paper made this story up about how the two of them met when they were teenagers and they were spurned by their male lovers, and so they vowed never to marry again, and they flipped a coin and decided who would be the man and who would be the wife. And I was kind of like, I don't, maybe, but they also lived together for like 35 years, and like they probably just loved each other, so yeah, that one was fun. So once I find the person and the name and I verify the facts, then well, I was going to say this is the fun part, but the whole thing's kind of fun. But coming up with the composition, like sometimes right away I'll get an image. So like with this person, Lisbeth Olstadter or Mats Ersson, like they were executed in the Haymarket in Stockholm, and they were made to wear male clothing, but with a female headdress. So I got this image in my head of this. And luckily, the Stockholm State Museum has an amazing digital archive of maps and etchings and artifacts that I could access. And so I was able to look at those maps, and you could go way back, like to the 1500s, and see these maps. So I could locate the Haymarket on the maps, and from this time period, 1670s, and I could see what buildings would have been around the Haymarket. And then because of the etchings, I could see what those buildings looked like, and even some of them were like labeled, which was very helpful. So I could put those into the background of the painting, and then there's the artifacts, like the chopping block. And I also, at the same time, lucky for me, there was an artist traveling. I think they were French. They might have been Italian. Now I can't remember, sorry. They were traveling through Stockholm in 1679 making drawings. So I was like, wow, I love you. And I was able to use those ink drawings as a resource to help me with like what the actual people were wearing, and put that into the background there. So they had these like staffs, and yeah, this one I really liked doing because I just had the opportunity to get really detailed and accurate. Yeah, plus painting blood in snow was kind of fun. Helen Oliver or John Oliver, this one, like, I just wanted to really show them doing their job, like making a living, because every time they were discovered, they would have to move town and start all over again. And it was difficult because it's hard to find resource material of working class people. So finding an image or images to help me like with what a plasterer was wearing and what tools they were using and what that looked like in Scotland was kind of hard, but I was able to find an illustrator at the time who was out of London named W.H. Payne, and he made a book of all the trades. And he actually didn't draw a plasterer, but it still helped me kind of get a sense for what people were wearing. And this piece, I actually was able to go to the Boston Public Library and look at a book of his drawings, and so I could see like the tools, and it was surprising to me to see what they were wearing. Like this guy with his like kind of jaunty kerchief, you know, like while he's like butchering a cow. So these were really helpful, and then finding you know, old catalogs of tools, and then plastering a house in Scotland is kind of a special thing because it's like lime plastering process, and I was like, okay. So I ended up actually watching a bunch of YouTube videos on how to plaster a traditional Scottish house. That was super fun. So yeah, here's this guy. I could get the gesture that way, you know. And whoops, and so then yeah, this is like what the house kind of looks like, and I could put all of that information into the paintings. And then in terms of like likeness for the people, that's kind of hard. A lot of them, I have to imagine their portraits because they're, you know, there was no photography, or a lot of them weren't like well known enough to have paintings made of them. With a couple exceptions, like with Rosa and with Okuhara Seiko, photography did exist, and those two were relatively famous, so there are images of them. With Olga Suberbiller, the university she taught at made paintings of all the faculty, which I thought was awesome. Like, I think universities should do that. So I could use that. And then other times I have to work with descriptions. So in this case, with Biwachi Ichi, or a woman chief, I learned that there was an artist that was traveling with the upper Missouri tribes. He was a Swiss artist. And so I got his journal, and I was able to like look through there, and he describes meeting her. She was relatively famous at the time. She was the only woman chief around, and he describes her, and he describes her demeanor, and then he says like he got so excited that she presented him with a gift that he forgot to draw her or paint her portrait. And I was like, okay, but it was still really helpful. And then other places like the Smithsonian, you know, with their photography collection, even though like these are older, or newer rather, I could still get a sense of like the clothing, and then through the artifacts, she was a member of the Crow Nation, and so they were known for these like pastel colors and the geometric beadwork. So I could use these pieces to help me out. She also, I learned via his description, like identified as a woman, wore actually a female dress, so this is a traditional elk tooth dress, but she carried the robes and the tools of a man. So where women would decorate their robes with geometric patterns, the men would tell stories of their exploits in battle, and so she actually did that, which I found pretty cool. So that's how I depicted her, and then I used the border to kind of show the geometric beadwork patterns. And then, yeah, so like sometimes trying to find their own voice is easier than I would think. So in the case of Jean Bonnet, they were arrested like a gazillion times in San Francisco. I felt like terrible for them. Always constantly arrested in San Francisco for wearing male clothing. And so this is one of the excerpts from the newspaper that I really liked. It says, Jean Bonnet, the French frog catcher. She would catch frogs, or they would catch frogs out of the lake and sell them to French restaurants to make some cash. So the French frog catcher has been convicted for wearing men's apparel, although she says she has an other. Therefore, if she didn't wear it, she would be convicted too. How is Jean to keep out of prison? So I like that one a lot. And with Cora Anderson or Ralph Carino, it was the same thing. Like there's coverage in the newspaper, a lot of coverage in the newspaper. And then after they were put on trial and actually acquitted, then they told their own story to the magazines. So I was able to look at those. And so this is her in her own voice, like, my heart and soul are more of those than a man than a woman, she declares. And the psychology of it all is that I changed my sex by application. A woman, I worked as a man, lived as one, and associated with men. I gave no thought to my former existence except during the first period of fear and trembling when I believed I could not pass and the discovery would suddenly end my wild dream. So I like when I can like find how they are feeling and thinking. And then other times, maybe it's not their voice, but it's their things. And so with this case, with Olga, I was able to go to the Harvard Cabot Science Library, and they had Olga's textbooks. So I was able to pick those textbooks, like they had multiple versions of them. And I could go and I took some pictures, and it was down in this basement, and they had these beautiful like WPA paintings like stuck in a hallway. And I was like, oh man, like it's really cool down here. So then I could take the math from the textbook and put that on the chalkboard in the background. So I like that. This is who I'm painting now. I thought I'd put this in here just to show you kind of the process. This person is from Mexico City, and I've been working on this one sporadically. But yeah, so once I get the sketch down and I'm convinced with, you know, the composition, I changed this one many times because I kept choosing a place, like I had a specific location, the cathedral in Mexico City, so I could use that. But I kept picking parts because I don't know exactly what part. Like basically she was caught, well not caught in, but seen in the cathedral in Mexico City in, I can't remember, 1796. I'm still working on this one, so it's kind of like, caught in the cathedral, like seen taking the Eucharist out of her mouth after Holy Communion, which was a big no-no, and wearing male clothing. So she like takes it out of her mouth and shows it to witnesses and smiles and then like runs out of the cathedral. And so I was like, woo. And the priest was like super mad. So the priest goes to the Holy Office and was like, we have to find this person and arrest them for sacrilege. So when they find them, they're found watching it's like the Holy Monday processional. So they're watching the parade and blowing out the candles of the people who are participating in the parade. So I was like, I really like this person. This person's funny. And so they're arrested, and then the Holy Office or the Inquisition does some research, tries to figure out who this person is. And they've been arrested multiple times, but for like, minor offenses, like basically they were kind of a mischievous person, and for wearing male clothing. And so, but they wanted to determine if there was a crime of faith, and they couldn't really find a crime of faith. Like they were still like a devout Catholic, like I went to Mass all the time, so there really was no crime of faith. But during their investigation, they discovered that she had an inclination towards women. So like, well, okay, that's weird. So, but it wasn't under their jurisdiction, so they passed it to the government of, the colonial government of Spain, because it was Mexico at the time was under colonial Spain. And so then the government was kind of like, well, we don't have any precedent for this. We don't really know what to do with this. So she ended up being in prison for a couple years while they're passing this back and forth between the offices, trying to figure out what punishment to give. And eventually they determined, I can't remember what they charged them with, but they put them in a women's penitentiary that was meant to reform people, but it was just a prison. So yeah, that's where, I don't know where the story went from there. But so when I was doing the research trying to figure out where to put them in the cathedral, I kept learning new things. Sometimes I get really impatient and I want to get the painting going. And so I'm like, okay, I really like this. I'm going to put them there. But then I learned that that altar actually burnt down. So that's not going to be in the same era. And it was just really complicated. But I ended up choosing this view and I'm going with this. And yeah, so we'll see when this one gets done. And then the statues in the background, that's the Virgin Mary directly above and St. Anne on the side there, which I like that. I kind of like that threesome. Yeah, so sometimes the composition's pretty easy. I'll do a bunch of sketches. This is Sammy Williams, so a lot of different versions of them. This one was pretty fast. They were a lumberjack, so I knew I wanted to paint trees, so I wanted to put them in the forest, and doing all these different versions of that ultimately led to this painting. And sometimes I get a little bit amused by the source material. These are images from the late 1800s of lumberjacks in Wisconsin, but they look like album covers for Mumford and Sons. And these also look like my relatives in Minnesota, so I don't know. And then other times you find cool things like this on Instagram. Yeah, so this is an install shot of the show that I had of all 25. I wanted to wait to show the group until I had 25 as a random number, but 25 paintings made to show a large group. And yeah, so here they are. And then at the same time, I self-published a book. It's a small edition, and each of them is numbered and signed. And it's an edition of 300, and I have 40 left. And yeah, there's some in the gift shop now. And then it's all those 25 paintings, those first 25 paintings, and the stories and the sources. So, and that's it. That's what I have for you. Questions? Cool. I'm going to drink some water.
So I love your work, and I was raised Catholic as well. And the first time I saw your work, Amy Galvin showed some slides of your work, and I thought it was hilarious. you didn't talk a lot about humor here, and you're dealing with, like, this is serious subject matter, right? You're and it's, in many cases, very sobering to think about people living these lives. But also I feel like there's this element of kind of inside Catholic humor that, like, and Catholics talk about these things. Like, so I wondered if you could talk about that tension between the seriousness and the, sadness.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before, but I'm totally aware of it. And I think it's part of my way of dealing with hard subjects, like even with, growing up, like if I was ever confronted by people, I tried to make light of it, and I think that's just my natural inclination. And maybe it comes from, like, I don't know, but when I look at some of the holy cards, like St. Lucy with the eyeballs on the plate, I think that's kind of funny. And I don't know if everybody does, but like, there is that element of humor in those holy cards, and so it's kind of, yeah.
Well, actually, as a Catholic, you're not supposed to laugh at it.
Well, that's
okay.
That's what you do is you bring to the surface something that has been underground. And the other thing that I love about your work,
I know. Is this all the storms my fault? I don't know.
several things. One is that you cast light on the incredible history of prayer cards. When I came to the States and I was already collecting prayer cards, the response I got was, oh, are those things that are given at funerals? And instead, prayer cards are historically a means of giving to the masses, not only religion, but instruction and stories.
Yeah.
But the way in which the stories were constructed, of course, left out so much.
Yeah.
And so you bring out what is underneath. I think everybody who looks at the prayer cards says, why does St. Lucy have two pairs of eyes? Which ones are the real eyes? Or why is she strangled and she's still alive? There are gruesome aspects. But there are also other gruesome aspects that you are revealing that the prayer cards cover over.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, like when I talk about my use of prayer cards, because a lot of people come to me with other things that they associate with them, like, baseball cards and tarot cards, and, but I wasn't like, that would be sacrilege, like the tarot cards. So, but for me, prayer cards were like, they were a means to teach me about Catholicism, and so I immediately thought that was perfect to like use them to teach people about these, queer people from history. And I think too with Lucy with the eyes, or even with Katerina Link, like holding her head, like it's kind of like a way for me anyway to show like they survived. They got through these hardships, even though yeah.
Well, the other thing that you make me think about is how many virgins made really virgins.
I know.
Which I'm not supposed to say.
That's true. Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about the detail and everything that went into each one, and some of them, like for example, that one is very saturated in historically accurate pictures and clothing and details.
Yeah.
Were there a certain one where you found so much detail that you had to edit out some really interesting?
Yeah. Sometimes the story is so overwhelming and so long and complex that I'm like, I don't really know where to begin with this. Like, I could do a thing where like the figure's here and then I have a gazillion little vignettes around it, which I haven't done yet. But and when that happens, like, I'll kind of choose what struck me the most, about the story. And honestly, sometimes I like feel like I could do multiple versions of one person because their stories were so complex. Like Catalina Rosso is like that. Like her story is like really ornate, and the same with I don't have the image with me, but Elena or Eleno de Cespedes is like a really complex story. And I'm butchering the pronunciation of their name, but yeah. So sometimes it's just like, really hard to choose how to depict them, and then other times I'll like with Sammy Williams, I just like lumberjack. I instantly wanted to just go back to the Pacific Northwest and like paint trees, so I got it right away. But yeah.
Would you ever consider doing a portrait if you had found a really good story but you couldn't identify the person?
That has happened a lot, and that's actually when people ask me what's next, maybe that's next, because there's so many stories of people that are really awesome and there's no name. So
more than you find names.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I don't know what that would look like, but that might be what's coming, yeah.
Can I ask you how long does it take?
Sure.
Doing your research to bring this to the finish?
It depends. Yeah, each painting it depends. Like, to bring up Sammy Williams again, that was probably the quickest painting, because not only was it like a person from the United States, like I was very familiar with the location, like Montana and Wisconsin, and all of those records were super easy to access. I didn't have to look for translation assistance, and instantly got a composition idea in my head, so it was like maybe 2 months, and that was like really fast. And then other times, if the story is super complex and I need help with translation, or I need to outsource and try, librarians are my best friends. Like, they're so helpful. I can reach out and like have people grab stuff and send it to me, and like it, probably the most like Captain Wright actually with all the details. Took me a really long time to paint. The research was easy on that one, but the painting itself with all the details took me probably 3 months. And then maybe the longest painting might have been Mary de Chamont en Bassigny, who was a French, didn't include an image, but they were a weaver in France. And so that research took quite a bit of time, and then the painting's super detailed, so that probably took 5 to 6 months, but yeah.
So some of these persons were persecuted for wearing men's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in 19th century France, George Sand, made a big splash by wearing men's clothing, but by then, people were being killed for that. So I'm assuming that somewhere along, early 19th century, it becomes okay for women to wear pants?
Yeah, I mean, it's still seen, you still find a whole lot of like opinion pieces in the newspapers of people saying like, this is, blasphemy and like moral outrage. Like, there's a lot of funny articles about women wearing pants because it became really fashionable. So yeah, it did change over time.
Probably saved a lot of lives.
Yep, for sure, yeah.
Just to kind of piggyback on that, do you feel like there's kind of a time frame that you would focus on most, or have you thought about doing some more contemporary figures to show kind of how the issues facing people have evolved?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I meant to say that I'm focusing specifically on people born before the 20th century for the Butch Heroes, just like people because I wanted people who were less recognizable, who were forgotten. There's a couple exceptions, but I just felt like that was really important, and specifically because there's a lot of other artists that are doing more contemporary projects through photography or through other means that are dealing with the contemporary subjects, and I'm just really into history too. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.